welcome to meeting number 18 of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans.
Industrial and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and express gratitude that we're able to do the important work of this committee on lands they've stewarded since time immemorial. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting to continue its study on the review of the Fisheries Act. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sous forme hybride, conformément au...
Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Thank you, everyone is here.
Ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. The measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, but particularly the interpreters. You'll also see a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. But pursuant to our routine motions, I would like to advise committee members that all witnesses appearing virtually today have successfully completed the required technical testing. And I would just like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. En ce qui concerne l'interprétation,
as for interpretation, if you're on Zoom, you can select the appropriate channel, either floor, English or French at the bottom of your screen. And if you're in the room, you can use the earpiece and select your preferred language channel.
Sure. Pour les députés présents dans la salle.
For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, and the clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. Thank you for your patience.
To welcome our witnesses that we have here today. We have Kent Spencer, Aboriginal Affairs Advisor, and we have Mr. Scott Coltish, that's appearing here as well. So we're going to start with opening statements from the witnesses for 5 minutes or less, starting with Scott Coltish.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My focus will be on the law enforcement barriers faced by fisher officers. And thank you to all members of this committee for taking the time and having the interest in improving DFO, and in particular the Conservation and Protection Directorate, commonly known as CNP. As we know, DFO's mandate is large and complex and affects all Canadians in all regions of the country in one way or another. Hundreds of thousands of people in Canada participate in fishing and cultural-related activities and depend on DFO to properly manage, conserve, and protect our fisheries resources. Thousands of people across the country who work for DFO share these same interests, values, and goals each and every day they come to work. For CNP, the face of DFO to many fishers, First Nations, and the public at large, we are the uniformed law enforcement staff they see on the water, at the docks, on the riverbank, on the beach, at meetings, and sometimes in court. As with most law enforcement organizations in Canada, fisher officers, as do most police and other law enforcement officers, garner an increased level of respect due to their law enforcement mandate, profile, and responsibility to treat everyone with respect and fairness. Unfortunately, DFO as a whole has a lower level of trust due to what is seen as manipulation from high-profile politics, the ever-changing management at senior levels in DFO, questionable science in the eyes of the public, exclusion from decision-making, backroom deals, a lack of understanding and response to conflicting interests, and this is First Nations versus industry versus recreational fisheries and so on. This has resulted in the erosion of trust and confidence in DFO. In my 32 years service, I served under 7 prime ministers and 18 ministers of fisheries and oceans. The changes and impacts DFO face with each change of government and senior administration reverberates for months, if not years. These changes in leadership, staffing, policy directions, program funding, resource allocation, communication, priority changes and settings can have and have had disruptive influences on DFO and CNP. Consistency is a pipe dream under these circumstances. However, the compliance and enforcement expectations of the fishing public, First Nations, stakeholders, and the fishing industry and the public at large hasn't changed. They expect CNP to protect the fisheries resource, act in a professional manner, be free from political influence, always be unbiased in our compliance and enforcement actions, and to build and maintain trust with all. This significantly affects CNP's ability to provide compliance and enforcement in the field when confrontation and refusal to comply is now being seen as a rite of passage for many individuals and groups. Fisher officers are the true face of DFO. It is well known that police and law enforcement garner the highest level of trust and respect from the public when compared to government agencies. DFO needs to capitalize on this trend and to have fisher officers engaging with the public and stakeholders at every opportunity. CNP needs to work to be perceived that it works at an arm's length from the politics and decisions that are seen as being made by Ottawa using flawed science and being behind closed doors. These are words that if you look on the internet, you'll see a lot. CNP can have a functional relationship to fisheries planning and harvest, while at the same time a direct line report to National CNP Directorate managed by law enforcement professionals. Several issues I have in particular, if questioned, I have some advice on the idea of integrated resource management planning fishery notices. The National Fisheries Intelligence Service, which I was involved in its development back in 2011. Major case management as an investigative tool in DFO, and the undercover covert operations group that I managed in the Pacific region, I believe needs to be expanded, and I can discuss that or go over that a little bit if asked questions. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koltish. And next we're going to go to Mr. Spencer for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes. So you've got my background of who I am. My presentation today is going to talk specifically about the field officer and some of the issues that arise. In my various positions, I played enforcement's been a significant part of my job in a lot of ways. Some of the offenses, or some of the people that I used to deal with, are First Nations with recreational commercial fishermen. And the issue really for a lot of the enforcement folks nowadays has focused more on First Nations fisheries, simply because in the other two fisheries we have acts and regulations that govern the execution of those fisheries, that specifically lay out what a fisherman can and can't do. When we get to the First Nations fisheries, or the FSC, the Food Social Ceremonial Fisheries, the legislation is more ambiguous, and implementations of any charges are based on legal opinion. First Nations individuals are treated differently than rec and commercial fishermen simply because of their right to fish for food. And the way that the situation works now in the Pacific region and in the marine areas, if a First Nations individual is found in an investigation that's violated the communal license that they have, the investigation must be completed and may take anywhere from 100 to maybe 1,000 hours of investigative time. This includes getting search warrants, accumulating statements, all that put together. And then that's submitted to the Department of Justice for review. And after that, it usually takes between 4 to 2 years for a decision on whether charges are going to go ahead. However, the key factor in moving ahead with charges is based on support from the First Nations Chief and Council to move ahead. If they support it, then DFO will move forward on charges. If not, in most cases, charges are never put forward. And as a consequence, fishery officers are not willing to put the time and effort in to build a case where charges won't be approved. There's other instances where we have legislation that's contrary to each other. We have the what do they call it here? Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which is an ability of a First Nation on their own accord to put out or pick out a piece of territory within their area and make it a conserved area. What this means is it now keeps out all fishing activity within that area. However, DFO does recognize the IPCAs, but does not make changes in their fishing plans to accommodate. And then, therefore, we have situations where we have commercial fishermen going into areas that have been declared an IPCA, and the First Nations have chased them out of the area, claiming that it's closed. I've got another incident that I'm aware of where the First Nations have gone on their own authority, seized commercial crab gear in an area that was an FSC only area, and removed the gear and brought them back to their reserve. That occurrence is still under investigation. I think I'd just like to go to the conclusion at this point, and again, this is from the field personnel. First Nations fisheries are difficult for the fishery officer to enforce for a number of reasons. The FSC regulations or conditions of the communal license are ambiguous. The FSC, to place an FSC charge requires an inordinate amount of work to develop a file and to provide to DOJ to get approval to move forward. In most cases, charge approval is only granted where the Chief and Council will approve charges against their own members. This does not happen often. Fishery officers are unlikely to start an investigation where support from the Chief and Council are not to occur, and where there's a situation like the IPCA and DFO programs where there's a clash, fishery officers are not likely to try and get involved in that because there's no clear definition of what they should be doing. And finally, lack of resources, both monetarily and personnel-wise, to properly monitor FSC fisheries and offloading sites. They need more funding and more personnel. And finally, if some of these issues are not addressed, the department will lose complete control of the FSC fishery, which will lead to conflicts and violence with other user groups. And more importantly, the lack of control will lead to significant negative impacts to the fisheries resource for all user groups, including First Nations. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spencer, and that concludes our opening remarks. We're going to go into the first round of questioning, the 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the witnesses for coming today. To start off with Mr. Spencer, through the Chair, you spoke of ambiguous regulations. Are CNP people familiar with all the rights and reconciliation agreements that have been formulated over the last few years and supposed to have been gazetted, but oftentimes they're not gazetted? Do you think that officers have the familiarity with the RRAs that they should?
In most cases, the people that I know, yes, they're familiar with what's going on with the reconciliation agreements.
So where does the ambiguity arise?
The ambiguity arises basically. There's not too many reconciliation agreements on the West Coast that we have right now. There's a number that are ongoing, that have been worked through. But using, say, the Aboriginal Communal Fishing License regulations, there's not a lot of detail in it. It all puts the emphasis back on the communal license.
Okay.
And with the communal license, there's some ambiguity within them because of some of the court cases that have happened and changes to the communal licenses. So more work has to be done with the communal licenses, and when I say more work, that means basically starting again and having the discussion with the groups about licensing, about all their activities, the whole 9 yards. It's a big undertaking.
So we've had CNP personnel tell us that their job's gotten really difficult over the last 10 years. And you spoke of the ambiguity in regulations. Where does this leave the power of the Fisheries Act to carry out its #1 mandate, which is conservation of the resource?
This is where it gets very difficult. With First Nations, they have the first kick at the cat, if you will, or the first right to harvest fish for FSC. So the issue then is, when can they harvest? How much can they harvest? Especially if we have a situation where we have low runs and everything. So it's hard for CMP to enforce something where it's not specifically defined. So we can try and say you can harvest so many pieces of fish. But if the person goes over that, then it's difficult for us to charge, in the sense that maybe the extra fish is needed, because they'll make the argument that it's needed for additional people within the community. Mm-hmm. We need the food to survive, and I'm not disagreeing with any of that.
No.
But it makes it very difficult for a fishery officer who needs to be able to know this is right and this is wrong in order to try and enforce the act.
So if the act is not being enforced and there's ambiguous regulations and whatnot, and it's to the demise of the resource,
yeah,
it's going to affect First Nations and non-First Nations alike, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
So at the end of the day, do you think we should be somehow having a collaborative approach, or having everything carved in stone and letting the act do its work?
I think we need to have a lot more discussions with First Nations to establish what their true requirements are, and be able to basically have the discussions, know what they're going to want. Probably they're not going to be able to get it all, because you have to share that resource with other nations as well.
So, to Mr. Coltish, seems to be a lack of regulations being enforced over the last few years. Do you think there's any politics at play, and what's the effect on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that. The question, and in fact, I watched one of the previous sessions, and your comment in particular about the Fisheries Act, and did it need a lot of touch-up and so on? And my answer probably would be no. The regulations, the Act and the regulations is pretty clear. When it comes down to where it starts to get a little bit messy is, which much of the First Nations fisheries, but this applies both to the commercial and recreational as well, when we negotiate and the department determines harvest limit levels and so on, but particularly with the Aboriginal fishery, when the department wants to sit down and negotiate with individual bands, and there has been a determination on harvest levels to ensure conservation, and we'll call it salmon on the Pacific coast from where we are. They are the first group to get under food, social, and ceremonial. The idea that what we need to do is establish the idea that under a harvest agreement that it includes a quota, that it includes numbers. Every other fishery, the recreational fishery, commercial fishery, are pretty stringent when it comes to allocation, and I would say pretty accurate. When it comes to some of the First Nations fisheries and some of the individual bands that look at that, I don't believe there's a whole lot of confidence in the organization on numbers. So when it comes to the allocation of for instance, a catch on an Aboriginal fisheries, a communal license, and it says that the band is to harvest 35,000 pieces. The band, and many of them are having their own people out there, and they'll get numbers and so on, but there's a lot that don't. And those numbers that come back or don't come back constantly create a management issue when it comes down to, and conservation is the #1 concern. And from a law enforcement perspective, and this is what my comment was about integrated resource fishery or management fisheries, it doesn't matter whether or not it's a commercial, recreational, or First Nations. CNP are the ones that are going to be out there to enforce the closures, or if we've got a band or an individuals that are exceeding quotas and we can prove it, we're going to be the ones out there enforcing that. But the people that we're going to be relying on are our managers who are making the decisions that there is a harvestable amount, how much can be harvested, and if we end up taking people to court, they have to come and be able to substantiate that. Because DOJ looks at them as being an expert witness.
Mr. Golcher, we're well over time here. Just hoping we could wrap that up.
So there are some issues, but the law is good. It just needs to be applied.
Thank you very much, Mr. Small. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Clausen for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Coltish, you talked about there being erosion and mistrust within the DFO after 18 ministers, I think you said, in I'm not sure how many years, but in a number of years, in 32 years. Do you think that the ministers, though, have stayed within the Fisheries Act, and have they sort of all followed the same direction, or was there discrepancies in how the ministers were dealing with the Act?
Well, I think that anybody coming into that position, of course, I would hope that would have a genuine interest in the Department of Fisheries and of course the people that work for it, and ultimately the people in Canada that are associated and benefited from that. I've never seen one that I would say that didn't. Of course, in 18 there were more that I believe that were more efficient than others. At the end of the day, though, they rely on a great deal of the people at senior levels that work in DFO to educate them, to bring them up to speed. But they also bring in their own people at senior levels. They bring an influence. Let's face it, every one of you represent a constituency. Some have greater interests in fishing activities than others, who will call you with interests within the fishery, will explain things that are going on. And those have ultimately some decisions and some things that occur within the management of that fishery. What happens is that where you see these things occur, it's kind of like walking on a fast treadmill going straight. At times, it's great, but then all of a sudden you get bounced because decisions are made that reverberate all through the organization. And what we're truly looking for, and I said this in the Cohen Commission back in 2012 when I testified in the Cohen Commission, is we need some level of consistency within CNP. DFO, absolutely. But within CNP, we have to be insulated from the politics. Because if we're going to be looked upon as accredited, and we want to be accredited law enforcement organization, we have to be insulated from some of those political decisions, because ultimately we see ourselves as the people that are out there because decisions are made about closures and other, but we're protecting the resource and we're representing the organization when it comes down to those decisions to the public. We're the greatest communicators of DFO policy.
Okay, thank you so much. You also did talk about backroom deals, and I'm wondering if you can maybe give an example of what you would, what you've seen as backroom deals.
Well, what I've seen personally, and certainly heard of, but what I've seen personally is where you're in an organization where senior members of the fishing industry, owners of large companies that control a large portion of a fishing activity, vessels, companies, who have the direct lines of senior management in the region and in Ottawa on their speed dial, and can contact them directly and talk about activities and things and issues that then can be reflected, or the potential of it being reflected does not bode well to the idea of an unbiased fishery made on science, decisions made on science. And I think all of us that have worked within DFO, and I'm sure other organizations, cringe at the thought that people can phone our senior people like that and have these conversations that potentially are not based on the science. And right now, all it takes is look on the internet, and particularly on the East Coast right now. And if you were to talk to probably 10 people in any of those fishing communities and you ask them what confidence they have on the science DFO is using, I would dare say that the majority of them are saying that they don't believe it. They don't. And it's because that information that is being made is not getting down to the people who see it affecting them correctly. And that's what I said. I believe CNP can play a big role in that, because we're in the uniform. We're on the docks. We hear this. And we need to be able to give that to them, because they don't respect suits, sweaters, and sandals. That's what a lot of biologists wear suits, sweaters, and sandals. And I'm not saying the people aren't good. I'm saying that the good information that they're making and why is not getting to the very people that it needs to be. And that's why I say I think we can play a big role in that.
Mr. Spencer, you talked about reconciliation on the West Coast. It's an ongoing process. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how can we work on enhancing and furthering the reconciliation process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're getting very close to time, so if you could give a brief answer.
Okay, more consultation.
More consultation.
More consultation. There you go. That's getting to know the group, working more with the group. That will get us a lot further.
Thank you very much for being brief. Thank you very much, Mr. Clausen. Et prochainement, on va aller à Monsieur Deschênes.
And now we'll go to Mr. Deschênes. But before we start, please put on your earpiece. I hope it's working well for you. And now I'll go over to Mr. Deschênes. Thank you very much and good afternoon. I'm happy to be with you to deal with this important issue of law enforcement. Mr. Spencer, I've got a question for you. You were in the DFO for 35 years, and in your testimony, you've said that when it comes to laying charges vis-a-vis a member of a First Nation carrying out FSC fishing, that's permitted, but if it's done incorrectly or illegally, before you go any further, you're saying that you have to have the approval of the head, the chief of the band council before the charges can be laid. Is that what you said in your testimony? Have I got that right?
Yes. Basically, in most cases, before charges are approved, we need DFO, or Department of Justice, if you will, needs approval by the First Nation, or the chief and council, to move forward on charges.
Vous avez observé, je comprends donc des cas où.
So you've seen cases where there was fisheries that was illegal or something wasn't respected. There was an investigation, there were facts being collected, and a prosecutor agreed to proceed with this, but in the band council there was a refusal for those charges to be laid?
Yes.
Okay.
So charges were being requested. It went to the Department of Justice. There was a note in there that the nation did not support the charges, and after reviewing the file, the Department of Justice did not proceed.
So you're saying it was rare that prosecutions were actually approved?
No, they were not. The prosecutions were not approved.
Ils ont été autorisés par le Conseil de membres?
Were they ever approved by the band council?
Not in a number of cases, no. What normally happens if you're going to charge a member, in a lot of cases, the band council will not support charges simply because they believe it's a member's right to fish as they feel that they want to fish. And if the DOJ doesn't get that approval, it's very difficult to get charges approved.
Directive du MPO donc.
So there's the DFO direction to ask for approval from the band council and the chief. Well, during your career, when did you see that coming into play, and where did it come from, that instruction? to, first of all, get the approval from the chiefs of the bands.
As part of the requirement under the DOJ, the DOJ, Department of Justice, is looking for feedback from the nation if they go ahead to approve with charges. It's a standard document that they need in the file to know that if the band is going to approve the charges.
Has that always been the case since the Marshall decision?
Mr. Chair, I can speak to some of that. I was the fisher officer in many locations where we dealt with First Nations, as well as an area chief in charge of a large geographical area. Historically, really since the Sparrow decision in 1990, which was a key decision. In fact, I was on the boat that arrested Mr. Sparrow when this occurred back in the late 80s or early 80s. The organization has really moved to a collaborative approach, no question. It doesn't matter, again, commercial, recreational, but particularly First Nations, given the level of conflict that we've had in the past in certain cases. We still have, and I'm speaking that, 14 or 11 years ago when I worked, but there's still an ongoing issue when it comes down to some First Nations, where they simply don't agree with science, they don't agree with the organization, they don't agree with our authority in that regard to manage the resource. But now more and more, the standard operating procedure would be that we want to have them on board, we want to have an agreement with them, and then pursuant to that agreement, we will issue a communal license either simply for food, social, and ceremonial purposes, or also including sale.
Est-ce que ce que vous nous dites aujourd'hui, c'est que
So what you're saying today, that even if there's this agreement and even if FSC Fisheries is approved, if there's a member of the First Nation that doesn't respect this agreement and withdraws a resource that wasn't permitted, and if a fishery officer sees this, the only way in which charges can be laid is actually with the approval of the Band Council. Is that right?
Well, I think I can clarify, but we've had in the past where actions of a member that are egregious to the intent of the agreement that the band signs, they will often approve charges being laid because they don't agree with that action. Mm-hmm. But when politics start to become more and more involved versus the rule of law, and that's what we need to focus on, is the rule of the law and how it's applied. And if DOJ is reluctant, then we have to make sure that our cases are firm, our decision-making is firm, our science is firm, and then there's no reason to not charge other than the agreement. And if we can do that, and again, the constant updating of these agreements and negotiations has to occur. But at the end of the day, the minister has the ability to issue a license. That's what is required to anybody fishing. And
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Unfortunately, time's already run out.
We're going to move into the second round for 5 minutes, and Mr. Gunn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for joining today. Mr. Spencer, last week, or earlier this, what day is it today? It's Tuesday. Last week we heard from the National Chief Enforcement Officer from DFO, Peter Lambertucci. He said that DFO and fishery officers always enforced to the letter of the law, and politics never got involved in the decision-making process. Is that true?
And no.
Can you give examples of when politics got involved in a decision-making process?
Well, I would say this applies more, again, to FSC fishing because of the ambiguity of the situations and because of court cases and current litigation and a whole myriad of things. Did
you witness, maybe be more specific, did you witness the Department of Justice making decisions that were based in politics and not based on the letter of the law that changed over time?
I've witnessed Department of Justice making decisions based on new legislation, new court decisions that necessarily weren't in line with the letter of the law.
You mentioned earlier, we were talking about Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and I asked the National Chief Enforcement Officer who's in charge of openings and closing. And he said it's DFO, it's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And yet I've heard from fishermen that many of these areas are declared unilaterally by various Indigenous groups, and then fishermen go up and get chased out by Indigenous groups. I asked him if that was against the law. He said yes, and then I asked why there was no follow-up action from DFO, and he said they didn't have the resources to be able to manage those areas. Is that true, or is there a political decision being made to not deal with that situation?
I think it's a situation of, again, First Nations making a claim or a decision about their territory, and it's not in line with departmental fishing plans or departmental regulations, and so they don't know what to do.
But ultimately, they could enforce the law over those given areas. They have the resources to do so. They're making a political decision not to. At
this point, well, I would just say that it's a decision that is being made because there's not clarity on the situation. So there's no. If a First Nation declares an area, and then it's supposed to be open, but it's not, it's an area of ambiguity for the department.
Can I ask you, Mr. Spencer, then Mr. Coltis, if you have an example, feel free to jump in as well. You mentioned examples of charges not being proved by the Department of Justice after extensive work was put in by fisheries officers when it came to various, because the First Nations band did not support the charges. Do you have specific examples of maybe the most egregious case where you thought there should have been a charge approved that wasn't?
I can't say right now.
Mr. Coltis, do you have an example?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of examples. You first framed the question where politics were involved. I've got two examples that I believe, from a CMP perspective, where interference from a non-CMP staff, senior staff, had effect on our operations. They are earlier. One was in, I believe it was around mid-2000s. The other one was 2003, and they both involved the area directors making decisions that compromised CMP's ability to do their jobs. They were both brought and raised, and in fact, I was involved in one of them as acting director of CMP, and it went right to the Deputy Minister Larry Murray, who was our Deputy Minister at the time. And he was very decisive, and that decision was reversed, and it never happened again. The issue with regards to the politics, again, we've seen decisions that occurred, and I know there's been a lot of activity going on the East Coast with and potential confrontations that and they have been heard. We've heard of vessels that have been burned. We've heard of assaults that have happened. We've heard shots fired and things such as going on. And from an organization, much of that isn't under the Fisheries Act. That's civil disobedience and so on, where the RCMP and other policing agencies would get involved. And I can tell you that they do not want to get involved in that kind of stuff. They see it as a fisheries thing. At the end of the day, communication and talk is going to solve much of that. But
Sir, Mr. Coltis, we're well over time here. I'm going to have to cut you off.
Yeah.
If there's more that you want to share, please do so in writing, because I know there's this is definitely very interesting testimony. But with that, I'm going to go to Mr. Morrissey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My question to other gentlemen appearing, and thank you for your testimony here. I'd like to clarify your definition of politics involved. Define the politics.
Politics, that would be, in my view.
That in your view.
Okay, so in my view, that's interference from another group or some other higher official that will affect the outcome.
Have you ever been aware of a ministerial interference in a decision? Because you're using politics. The general public would look at politics as an elected official being involved. And we had testimony from the director of public prosecutions who, on the record, and we will get a chance to go back, who was very clear that they are independent of all political elected officials or senior from influencing their decisions. So I just want to be clear, there's a confliction between your perception, your terminology, and what the public may understand as it relates to politics.
So in terms of say, Department of Justice, in my view, the changes that could be made are made basically from further court cases, further things coming down the line where
But you're referencing court cases. We do live in a country under the rule of law in the courts, and all charges must respect the court decisions, and courts tend to be precedent in their decisions.
Yes.
So, and I'm not insinuating that we shouldn't go, because I do believe at the end of the day, it's not that I do believe, it must be that for the overall good of the fishery and the conservation, that infractions that clearly undermine conservation and protection of resources the individuals involved in this should face the full weight of the law. So that's what I want to get clear with this committee as it relates to the Act, if we have to strengthen more. But intermingling the term politics into it, that's what I want to be clear on. Is it senior management's internal politics within the ministry? Is that what you're referencing?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you hear that term from my career, I spent a lot of time what I would reference to dock talk, and that is being down on the docks, down on the boats. One of my jobs was with the halibut IVQ industry on the West Coast in the early mid-'90s, was to actually be down on the boats every time they came and so on. And when you look at a lot of the people that are associated to the industry who are vessel owners and lease owners and so on, they see politics within the organization, DFO, and above. And that would be up to the minister's level and so on. Now, personally, I've never encountered and I can't recite an issue that I felt that the minister interfered. In fact, I've had ministers on board my boat out on patrols chatting on different things. But the general public and the fishing industry and First Nations, they see politics at the regional levels, sometimes as low as the area levels, and certainly at Ottawa. And there's a lot of the idea that decisions are made in Ottawa that affect West Coast, East Coast, and don't reflect the interests of the local industry issues and concerns.
Yeah, that's fine, but that's not where we're going, and that's why I found some, I'll be candid, some conflict in your testimony and answers that you've been giving here, is those specific areas where this bill could be improved to ensure that does not occur. And there will always be court decisions that will go in a particular direction, which will then influence further action on infractions. That's just the way this country is for time eternity, again under the Supreme Court and the letter of the law. So that's what concerns me when too much without a lot of background reference, when one keeps throwing in the terminology, politics was involved in this kind of politics. So I'll close. I know I'm over time. So I do think you did clarify that the politics you were referenced to was internal within an organization, internal on wharf talk and a whole host of areas.
What the public sees. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrissey. On va terminer cette panel avec...
So we'll finish this panel with Mr. Deschênes for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Coltish, could you give us more details? In your written testimony, you talked about two events in 2006 and 2014. In 2006, you said you were participating in an investigation. There was £1.9 million of salmon that was discovered. Could you talk about what happened and how this finished and why there were no charges laid in that particular case?
So this is probably one of the most identifiable cases that ties. Sorry, Mr. Chair. We have on the Fraser River and in the south coast of British Columbia, we have a large food, social, and ceremonial fishery by First Nations. In particular, on the Fraser River, we have a number of bands from the mouth of the river all the way up the river, and they fish for food, social, and ceremonial.
Alors, allez-y au fait, s'il vous plaît.
Could you please go to the facts because I don't have much time at all.
We entered into an investigation to try to determine the amount of food, social, and ceremonial salmon that was being kept in cold storage facilities. These are generally large cold storage facilities where commercial fishermen often and companies will store their fish as well. We conducted this investigation over a number of months and found that there was about 1.9 million pounds, or approximately 358,000 pieces, in cold storage, kept in a variety of conditions, but mostly cut into small packages and vacuum packed and so on. Much of it was not marked. Much of it, some of it was, but it was owned by a number of people, but most of it by a small number of individuals, most of them First Nations individuals, some owning thousands of pounds of this product. And some of these individuals had a history with our organization, CMP, for suspects activity with the ideal of sale. And this is the concern that we had, was this large volume of fish, and it costs money to process this fish. So who's paying for that money when this fish is actually food fish, if you want to call it FSC? So we asked the senior management in the region for additional funding to track it the following year. We were denied. We were turned down. That, as a result of that, we were no longer able to conduct an investigation or continue the investigation to determine who owned the fish, where it went, and particularly where it was going throughout these communities, if it was FSC fish. We did an audit in the summer of 2006, and we found that 70% of this product had gone with no way of tracking it. If we had, and this I'll tie into the major case management, if we at that time had the ability to conduct these investigations with the use of major case management principles, and we had funding that was provided to us through a CMP directorate, not through the region, we would probably have been able to continue this. Now, things may have changed. I'm hoping they have. But in this particular case, this was a very large investigation that in fact, it affected our ability and our interest to do large-scale FSC after this investigations because of it being turned down.
Thank you very much, Mr. Colters. We're well over time, but that finishes our time for today. Of course, if there was anything that came up in questions today that you wanted to share that we weren't able to get to, please do submit that in writing. And I can tell that both you, Mr. Coltish, and Mr. Spencer, have a wealth of knowledge. So if there's anything that we weren't able to speak to that you'd like to share with the committee, please do so in writing. That'll be very helpful as we finalize our report and recommendations that are going to flow from it. So with that, I want to thank you very much for appearing today, and we're going to briefly suspend while we welcome our next panel. Just want to start by making a few comments for the benefits of our new witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And for those participating by video conference, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and be sure to please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Et en ce qui concerne l'interprétation.
As for interpretation, if you're on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select either floor, English, or French. And if you're in the room, you can use the earpiece and select your preferred language channel.
That all comments will be addressed through the chair. And with that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses here today from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Mr. Peter Lambertucci, National Chief Enforcement Officer, welcome back. We have Paul Didham, the Supervisor, Major Case Management, Newfoundland Region by video conference. We have Neil Jensen, Chief of Recruitment, Training and Standards, Pacific Region by video conference as well. We have Trevor Lushington, Fisheries Officer, Ray McLeave, Program Officer, On-Site Training Coordinator, also by video conference. And then we have also Mr. Jeff Thorburn, Fishery Officer and Acting Habitat Coordinator, Vancouver Island and Sunshine Coast. So I understand most of you would like to make a short opening statement, and I will allow it, with the understanding that we may extend this hour by about 10, 15 minutes if members want to have their full questioning time. So we're going to start with the opening statement for Mr. Lambertucci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, committee members. I am pleased to be here today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Aninashibig people, and I would like to thank the committee for their interest in the work of conservation and protection and for inviting fishery officers to appear before you today. I am incredibly proud of the work done by all our officers across this country, coast to coast to coast. Recognizing that today is my third appearance before the committee in recent weeks, and the value in having frontline conservation and protection officers before you as witnesses, I will keep my opening remarks very brief, allowing the officers more time to read their opening remarks, and so the committee can maximize the time they have for officers' testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lambertucci. Next, we'll now hear from Mr. Jensen.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak here for the first time. I'm Neil Jensen, the Chief of Recruitment, Training and Standards for Pacific Region. I've had a diverse and extensive career in Pacific Region, serving as a general duty officer and supervisor in the BC Interior, the South Coast, Lower Fraser, and the BC Aquaculture Enforcement Unit before coming in as a regional manager here at headquarters. Over that time span, I've seen a lot, including many ups and downs, the evolution of the Conservation and Protection Program to what it is today. I've enjoyed many experiences and achievements over the years and still love the job as much as when I first joined many years ago. You'll hear many interesting insights from my colleagues today, and I look forward to answering questions. But I want to highlight two key topics of interest. First, revising the Fisheries Act. In doing so, a top priority should be to enable better traceability to prevent fish laundering. Currently, proving or getting charges approved for larger investigations into illegal fish sales is almost impossible. Stronger traceability would be a game changer for officers and a major deterrent to fish trafficking. This is a significant issue in Pacific Region and needs to be addressed urgently. My second point is towards fishery officers and in relation to the peace officer status of them. For many years, the Criminal Code's definition of fishery officers as peace officers has been unclear, creating confusion about when they hold that status while on duty. Recent opinions leave officers uncertain about liability coverage and legal authority. At times, they may be viewed as private citizens despite being armed and in uniform. Other times, they're acknowledged as full peace officers. It's not something that can be just turned on and off with a switch. Officers do not feel supported in their authority and protections, and uncertainty could cause hesitation at critical moments, leading to harm or other negative outcomes. Clear, consistent peace officer status is essential for officer safety and public trust. And that just concludes my brief statement, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to hear from Mr. Lushington.
Good afternoon. Hello, my name is Trevor Lushington. I've been a law enforcement officer for 32 years in total, 25 with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I'd like to share with you, or I'm here today to speak about barriers in law enforcement in regards to the Fisheries Act. I'd like to share with the group that in the last 5 years, there's been significant barriers presented to us in law enforcement. Our work as a fishery officer has got a lot more dangerous. Conflicts have increased with the fishery officers and the work that we're doing. And that conflict, it's resulted in our ability to have less impact to protect the resources. So if we looked at what happened in the last 5, now I would like to take a second and look at what's happened in the last 5 months. We've seen a significant change. We are able to demonstrate that now with the work that we've done that's being posted, that's being shared with you guys. We have new communication lines with our enforcement chief that go directly with the Minister of Fisheries. We've saw a number of pieces of equipment that have been handed over to fishery officers to make our work much more safer. These would include drones and body-worn cameras. We have more operational vessels that we're able to use and put in key strategic areas where they need to be and when they need to be. So I guess in closing, I've been following along the work that this committee is done. And honestly, I'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you. You are making our job better. And the boards that you're trying to lift up and see what's underneath it, we appreciate it. It is going to make our job better, and we're protecting a resource that I honestly care a lot about. I'd like to leave you with a short comment that I remember as a younger fishery officer in a judge in a courtroom in Shelburne. And the judge said, "These fisheries are the lifeblood of our communities. They mean a lot to us." And I'll just go right back to the beginning. I look forward to hearing some questions from you. So I cut my 5 minutes down because I wanted to hear what you had for questions as we reach the end of your sessions. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. And with that, we're now going to hear from Mr. Thorburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak today. I'm here to provide a frontline perspective on challenges fishery officers face enforcing the Fisheries Act across Canada. My comments reflect daily operational realities by officers in the field. Number 1, lack of charge approval for files involving Indigenous harvesters. One of the most consistent obstacles in obtaining charge approval for investigations involving unauthorized harvest by Indigenous individuals or groups. While we respect treaties and rights-based fisheries, some activities clearly fall outside established agreements, jeopardizing the conservation and protection of fish for all Canadians, including other Indigenous peoples. Yet the threshold for prosecution is so high that many files did not receive the charge approval despite months and years of effort by fishery officers. This creates inconsistent enforcement and undermines our officers' ability to apply law fairly and uniformly. Number 2, lack of traceability in the supply chain. Canada does not have a full end-to-end traceability system for fish moving from harvest to market or accurate reporting of food, social, and ceremonial catch. As a result, illegally harvested fish, including non-saleable FSC product, continues to enter the commercial supply chain with little ability to confirm origin. This harms legitimate harvesters, including Indigenous, commercial, and recreational fishermen, encourages black market activity, and increases food safety and export risk for Canadian markets. Number 3, organized crime exploiting fisheries and the need for peace officer status. We are seeing increased involvement of organized crime groups using Indigenous harvesters and their rights as a means to launder illegal fish. These individuals from Indigenous communities who participate in this laundering take food away from their own people and, in the long term, the necessary conservation and protection measures to ensure a moderate livelihood. Our officers often lack the investigative resources, the interagency communication, and most importantly, support from Indigenous communities needed to confront these networks. To combat organized crime, fishery officers require peace officer status. This will allow us to enforce legislation outside the confines of the Fisheries Act, providing needed tools to meet organized crime head-on. Our current enforcement structure is not built to counter the sophistication and scale of our criminal groups active in the fisheries sector. Therefore, we need peace officer status to give us the tools to reach outside the authority of the Fisheries Act. Number 4, insufficient number of officers, limited budget, and chronic underpayment. Fisher officers cover a vast geographic area with staffing levels that do not have kept pace with modern pressures, including rights-based fisheries, commercial expansion, and habitat complexity. Many detachments operate with minimum staff, leaving capacity for proactive patrols or complex investigations difficult. In addition to being understaffed, fisher officers remain significantly underpaid relative to the risks and responsibilities of the job. We work armed in remote locations in harsh conditions and frequently deal with organized crime, dangerous vessels, and high conflict encounters. Yet compensation often aligns more closely with trades such as window cleaners or fish hatchery technicians, who face none of the statutory safety or enforcement responsibilities fisher officers carry. For an officer to earn a full field level officer pay, it takes 7 years. Fisher officer trainees require 3 years of training prior to graduating as a full-fledged fisher officer and 4 more years to get paid a top-level GT4 officer wage, the longest training period of any enforcement agency in Canada. Number 5, examples of setbacks when changes to the Fisheries Act are made without foresight and ideas for habitat compliance in the future. In 2012, changes to the Fisheries Act shifted protection from all fish and fish habitat to only those supporting economically viable fisheries, forcing fisher officers to prove both commercial value and serious harm to fish, leaving many species without protection. Recent revisions since 2019 have restored protections for all fish and introduced tools like corrective measure orders, which allow proponents the opportunity to fix non-compliant activities. However, officers still lack a timely, impactful way to address minor violations, and one proposal is a licensing system to ensure work around fish-bearing waters are being carried out responsibly. Each license comes with a condition of license, much like that of a commercial fishery, allowing fisher officers the ability to issue tickets for less serious non-compliance issues. However, have a more immediate impact ensuring conditions of the licenses are complied with in a more timely manner. Number 6, lack of direct communication between management and frontline officers. Many policy and operational decisions are made without meaningful input from the officers tasked with implementing them. This disconnect leads to policies that cannot be practically enforced, unclear operational expectations, and inconsistent application of the Act across regions. Frontline enforcement and management insight should be built into decision-making rather than added after the fact. Incidents such as those in southwest Nova Scotia where officers were suspended and persecuted after an arrest for illegal overfishing is a stark reminder to officers that there are limited protections from the political will of the day should enforcement action garner negative media attention. In closing, we need more officers, support staff, and vastly improved pay structure, peace officer status, and the legal support to keep pace with the pressures on the resource and the complexity of the enforcement environment. Lastly, our agency is the oldest enforcement agency in Canada. We stand on the backs of fisher officers that came before us. We need the recognition we duly deserve as frontline enforcement officers. In the past 2 years, our support networks have missed the opportunity to ensure we are recognized as frontline enforcement officers. And we need our government's support to ensure there will not be a third. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thorburn, and we're going to last hear from Mr. McLeave.
Mr. Chair and committee members, thank you for inviting us to testify today. It's my pleasure to be here to speak to the operational and legal challenges that fishery officers experience in enforcing the Fisheries Act. My name is Ray McLeave, and I have been a fishery officer with DFO for 25 years. Most of those years were spent as a frontline officer, field supervisor, and eventually a detachment supervisor in both the Gulf and Maritime regions. Prior to becoming a fishery officer, I was a deckhand on board a lobster fishing vessel in Southwest Nova, in LFA 34 for 5 years. In addition to my current position, I'm also on the National Executive of the Union of Health and Environment Workers as Regional Vice President for the Scotia Fundy region. Throughout this study, you've heard many allegations of fishery officers not enforcing the Act. I hope my testimony can shed some light into the complexities of our work and balance your views. First, let's face it, doing more with less is not practical in our line of work. We've used to have detachments with 10 or more officers, and now we try to operate with half of that or less. Fishery officers cannot possibly respond to every complaint. We operate with limited resources, both in terms of finances and personnel, to protect Canada's fishery resources along the longest coastline in the world. The retention of personnel is an ongoing issue, as and wages based on a 1969 job description for glassblowers does not help matters. Once trained, new officers often decide to pursue alternative law enforcement careers with a federal or provincial law enforcement agency, which pays substantially more. Fishery officers do not have a public safety mandate. While our uniform, duty belt, and service weapon may lead the public to mistake us as police, fishery officers do not have the same powers as police. Our peace officer status is functionally limited to the performance of our duties under the Act. We do not have the mandate, authorities, or legal protections to act as peace officers in matters outside of the Fisheries Act, such as physical altercations between harvesters on the water, possession of drugs, or driving under the influence. Those are matters for the police of local jurisdiction to handle. If our conscience and personal morals bring us to act in a situation outside of our mandate, we do so at our own risk, as simple citizens with no guaranteed protection provided from DFO. As fishery officers, we do have vast inspection powers. Officers must apply these powers in a reasonable and lawful manner to ensure the integrity of the department and those who represent it. When we have reasonable grounds to believe that a violation has occurred, we do investigate. As fishery officers, we use our discretion to decide the level of enforcement to engage in, ranging from education, warning, to full investigations and up to the laying of charges. As Government of Canada law enforcement officers, we are bound by the strict authorities granted to us by the Fisheries Act and the Criminal Code, and we must uphold the legal protections that are guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. To bring charges forward, we must show to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada that there is, one, a reasonable prospect of conviction, meaning that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person committed the offense. And then second point would be that it is in the public interest to prosecute. As you've already heard, PPSC determines this, not fishery officers. This committee has heard allegations that fishery officers did not take action against potential illegal fish harvesting, or that they failed to use information provided to them by members of the public, including industry. It needs to be clarified that although members of the public may not feel that the work is being done in relation to illegal fish harvesting, the actions that are taken cannot be shared with the public outside of proceedings that have been put in front of the court. Doing so would be a severe violation of a person's charter rights, which we must uphold if there's any hope of achieving a successful prosecution. Fishery officers enforce the Act and the regulations. When it comes to license conditions, those are imposed by DFO officials in the Resource Management Branch, insofar as those officials impose conditions that are within the legal authorities of Section 22 of the Fishery General Regulations and duly consulted with impacted First Nations when relevant, those license conditions would be enforceable and actionable by fishery officers. I hope that this clarifies the operational and legal reality in which we operate, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeave. And that concludes our opening remarks. We're going to jump into our first round of questioning, the 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to Mr. Didham. Mr. Didham, what's your current role with DFO?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm currently the supervisor for major case management within the Newfoundland and Labrador region.
So, what type of cases do you investigate?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. Generally, I would be involved in investigations that are they're a little bit more complex, require more resources, more time, more in-depth type investigations that general duty frontline officers within our detachments would not have the resources or ability to do.
So would you have investigated any fleet separation aspects that are covered by the Fisheries Act?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I would have.
So how's that been going for you?
Again, thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. In relation to how is it going, I guess if you have something more specific, I mean, we've had a number of investigations that we've been conducting. We take complaints as they come in, but is there something specific?
So well, there's been no charges laid since the 2019 Act became, came into law here. So is the Act protecting owner-operator from controlling agreements, do you think?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. I think the wording of the Act and the regulations in particular regarding the concept of controlling agreements or a transfer of the use and rights and privileges as assigned to licenses, I think the wording has some good strengths in there. The application of the regulations, what I've been a part of over the last couple of years in relation to some investigations, has not been successful.
So have you had any investigations where you felt that you had the evidence to move forward and prosecute?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I have had investigations where I felt that there was sufficient evidence, certainly to move forward with an investigation, whether we got to a prosecution phase, but certainly to move forward with an investigation, yes.
Have you ever had any of these cases where you've asked for fishing licenses to be suspended during investigations?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I have.
And what was the result?
Thank you again for your question. Mr. Chair, I've had on occasion, on several occasions, to request licenses that they be suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. And initially, the licenses were suspended. The activities of the license were suspended. But subsequent to that, the suspension on the license and the activities related to them were then put back in place, and things were allowed to move along with the licensing process.
So was that lifting of the suspension based on your request?
Thank you again for your question. Mr. Chair, no, I did not request the licenses to be released, for the activities to be released.
So who overruled you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know what I would consider overruling. I know there's a lot of activities going on in relation to other pressures in relation to licensing and requirements, but as it relates to the decision, I don't know who would have made those decisions.
So we had Jimmy Lee Foss here a few weeks ago. Did you investigate that case?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I did. I was involved in the investigation into Mr. Foss's matter and his complaint.
So do you believe that there was a controlling agreement in place? Was there evidence that in the case of Jimmy Lee Foss there was a controlling agreement in place, and were there others with similar evidence that you've dealt with over the years?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, in relation to Mr. Foss's matters, I do believe that there was evidence that supported our belief that there was controlling agreement in place here. We didn't get to the final conclusion on that, but certainly as the initial information and moving through our investigation, the information led me to believe that there was issues with the control of his license.
So has the Public Prosecution Service been involved in any of these controlling agreement investigations? Have you had evidence where you would have taken it to that next step before charges were laid?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I did. As part of our investigations, the gathering of the information, I was in a place in 2024, the spring of 2024, where our investigative team prepared a brief which was submitted to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada for we requested advice on those files.
So we had the Public Prosecution Service here a few days ago, and basically they said that if it wasn't in the public's interest to prosecute, then they wouldn't. So where does that leave the power of the Fisheries Act to protect the fishery and all the various clauses that are in the Act if we've got a Public Prosecution Service that decides that it has to be in the public's best interests?
So I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump in here. We're over time, but Mr. Didham, if you'd like to provide a response in writing, that would be appreciated. But at this point, we're going to go to Mr. Cormier for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll ask some questions in French and English. So first of all, thank you all for the work that you are doing for the protection of the fisheries and our ocean in this country. So thank you very much for all of that. First question, Mr. Lushington, if I'm pronouncing it right. So you said in your statement that the last 5 months there was some significant changes. That you saw more charges being put in front of the court. New lines of communication with the minister's office and deputy minister, new equipment, more operational vessels. So I think my question is, why all those changes lately? Like, why do you see those changes happening?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I don't know why it happened, but it did, and I'm glad it did, because prior to that 5 month, the last 5 months was a real challenge for us. We were asking for equipment. Our work did become more dangerous. Now, I think it would have been, and what I feel, it has a lot to do with a closer relationship with our National Chief of Enforcement, having faster communication with the Minister of Fisheries, more direct communication with the fisheries, and that results in faster reaction to current situations that we need as boots on the ground. Okay. When we finally got body cameras and drones in the air, that made our work significantly safer, which is what we needed to carry on and do our work.
Okay. Mr. Lambertucci, yeah?
Thank you very much for the question. And Mr. Chair, just one point of clarification. We do enjoy a law enforcement independence. And although I am new to the role, we have enjoyed that law enforcement independence. No disrespect to my colleague, Mr. Lushington, I just wanted to point out that the minister doesn't control our operations and our operational tempo or tactical operations.
So we know that it's challenging sometimes when it comes to dealing with the issue with First Nation or even commercial fishers. On the waters, that things can happen, and like people have a tendency of having a certain view of how the law is enforced, for example. So do you think, like, for example, in with First Nation, that there's enough there in the law to make arrests when it comes to First Nation not respecting the law? For example, food, social, and ceremonial, under the law, it's not, allowed to sell these catches. Like, do you feel that there's enough in the law to make those arrests, for example?
Thank you for your question, and I certainly get your point. I'd go back to a little bit. Let's go back to 2020, 21, 22. Fishery officers were doing their job. We were actively doing and enforcing the acts and the regulations. And because the matter was coming in, First Nations was trying to get a position in a fishery that was fully subscribed. We had to look at our files through a very strict lens to make sure that we were not committing any infringements on their constitutional rights.
Okay.
So going forward, where are we at today? We really haven't received a lot of guidance or directions from lawmakers, Department of Justice. We would like to see more files that progress through the system for two reasons. A file that progresses through the system and is found guilty, it will help us design our law enforcement operations, and we want those operations to be parallel with their constitutional rights. So if we're a long time getting those directions, if we call it the directions from the court, we could be repeatedly doing an infringement on the right. So your question to me is very important. Where are we at today? We certainly could use more direction.
Okay.
The license conditions are getting better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Une question que j'ai posée auparavant.
And a question that I put before, and I'll put it to you as well. Do you think that the fines are high enough? Sometimes we see that charges are laid upon individuals, they go before the courts, and then they get a $250 fine for their offence. So they start the next day with the same process. They do poaching again, another $500, and off they go. So if you'd higher fines, would that help you if, as fishery officers, or if we could revoke licenses, should we do that so that it would make your work a bit easier? So that day after day and month after month, year after year, you're always stopping the same people for the same offences.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. You're hitting the nail on the head. We have a lot of repeat offenders. Mm-hmm. That tells us that we are out there doing our job, but the fact that they're coming back to break the law again, even sometimes during a time of arrest, making statements to us like, we'll see you tomorrow night, is frustrating to the officers. It's not providing the protection to the resource that we want. And we have to look at the rights for our First Nations. If the resources is damaged, so are their rights. Mm-hmm. So we do need higher fines, more of a deterrent, having a conversation about more suspensions, and having a conversations that we could release with restrictions, so we don't see them there the next night when there is a delay before they get through the court system. Mm-hmm. So we're not dealing with multiple repeat offenders. Thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cormier. Et prochainement, on va à Monsieur Deschênes.
And now we're going to go to Mr. Deschênes for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Now for Mr. Lushington, can you hear me well?
Okay, merci.
Thank you for that. Do you feel free to testify before the committee today? Do you feel free to do so?
That is a good question. And honesty is what leads me. I was asked to testify before this committee on December the 2nd. I recall the Chief of Enforcement offering us an opportunity to testify. When I am asked about, in a conversation as a law enforcement officer, when we speak about immunities and testifying, I've learned that I'm a bit of a deer on ice when it comes to being in this room as opposed to being in a courtroom. And I'm just being honest with you. So if I could go forward, I learned about duty to be loyalty. As a civil servant, I learned about other things that I was not always thinking about as when I was first asked to testify. That was a real challenge for me. In all honesty, it really was. It's not that I wouldn't extend loyalty to our current minister. I probably would. But when I got myself into a conversation, and it was honestly troubling for me, when we began to talk about, testifying and discovery of the need to pay your bills. How would you pay your bills if you had no job? That's worrying. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So you've said it's important to be able to pay your bills. So who said that to you, and what was the context of that discussion?
Thank you for the question. The contents of the question was helping me, whether it was out of context or in context. It was providing me what I believe was my responsibility to review my obligations as a civil servant. As coming here today, and when I say I would agree to testify, I put the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth at the top of the line. And again, I'm being honest. It was a challenge for me because this other matter that I was unaware of became.
So I can correctly understand. There was somebody who said that the importance of paying your bills and keeping your job. Who exactly said that to you?
Yeah, I understand. It was Parliamentary Affairs that had reached out to us. While I was actually getting on the plane, I read an email. The email in the government of Canada, usually when you have an email, it's sent out with a signature. The first email I got had no signature. I kind of I didn't give it much credit. And then when I was reached out as getting on the airplane on December, like would have been December the 1st, it was a new discovery to me. Like, these new things apply. It's a challenge to want to come and speak openly.
Du cabinet ministériel qui vous a rappelé que ça.
So they were saying it would take you having a job to be able to pay your bills. Is that what you got from the departmental note?
What I got from the conversation that I had was that my employment would be affected if I testified as an individual on that day.
Et maintenant, et donc on va profiter des secondes qui nous restent, Monsieur Lushington.
So we've just got a few seconds left. Mr. Lushington, as a fisheries officer, have you been put under pressure at some point from your superiors, senior management, to not actually intervene in a case where there was non-enforcement of the law?
Just want to go back to the last part of when you're finished. Have I ever been told to not intervene when there was an infraction out there? To that answer, to that question, I would say no. My leadership in the area that I work in, we're always directed to deal with any matter that has relations to do with a conservation issue or if we were able to conduct enforcement operations that were within the regulatory framework, we were always encouraged to do so.
OK. Est-ce qu'il est arrivé des moments où il y a eu des...
Were there times where there were instructions given where they said, in that type of case, it's better for you not to intervene?
No. Thank you again. Thank you for the questions. And again, I'm testifying today what I do in my area. We've never been told not to intervene. There are times where we've gone through experiences where we've had weak-worded license conditions, which were license conditions that were imposed or brought into our regulations, despite CMP opposing them. They were brought in, and they never met the standard of the court system, and it was a failed prosecution. And so in that matter, many of our seizures that we seized, in particular at the Halifax airport, we seized $113,000 worth of illegal product that we had to give back because the wording was weak. It didn't stand up to the scrutiny of the court systems. That created officer frustration. It also breaks a little bit of trust in what we're trying to accomplish. It doesn't provide any shield for protection for the resources.
Dans votre témoignage écrit, vous dites que la...
In your written testimony, you've said illegal fishing is on the rise. How could you explain that?
And Mr. Lushington, we're at time, so if you could be brief with that answer, please.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'd be glad to respond in writing. It's not something that I can do brief. There's many elements to why that is occurring, and I thank you for the question. I will respond in writing if you want.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Deschênes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deschênes.
First round of questioning. Moving into the second round, Mr. Arnold, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start off by asking Mr. Lushington, I'd like to move a motion because of the testimony we just heard, a motion to request Mr. Lushington to provide the email that he spoke about in his testimony, provide that email exchange to the committee. That's a motion.
I pause this time for this, Mr. Arnold. Looks like we've got unanimous consent in the committee for the production of this email.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to go back to your time. You have 4 minutes and 50 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lambertucci, well, I should actually pause for a moment and thank all of you as conservation officers, Mr. Lambertucci as the head of that department, for all of the work that you do. Sometimes it's thankless work in protecting the resource, and I believe that is why every last one of you initially signed up. So thank you. But I'll turn my question to Mr. Lambertucci. On October 9th, Minister Thompson told this committee that the Minister of Fisheries is ultimately responsible for managing Canada's fisheries resources. Mr. Lambertucci, who is actually responsible for enforcement of the Fisheries Act and associated regulations?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So CNP Conservation and Protection enjoys that law enforcement independence to enforce the Fisheries Act. Department of Fisheries and Oceans has a regulation side that writes the regulations.
Okay, thank you. And which laws are CNP entrusted to uphold? Laws?
All regulations within CNP enforces.
Okay, when CNP personnel are assessing the legality of activities in and around fisheries, do you determine if the activities are legal or illegal by measuring the activities in question against the laws and regulations you're entrusted to uphold?
So just for clarity, to make sure I understand the question, we have conditions of license that frame part of the regulations. We benchmark against those conditions of license when we approach an incident, and
those conditions of license would be within the laws and regulations. Correct?
That's correct. We would follow those conditions of license.
Thank you. Mr. Lampedusa, are you familiar with the Fisheries Act definition of the word laws? The reason I ask is in 2019, the Liberal government amended the Fisheries Act to establish a new definition for the word laws that states the word laws includes bylaws made by an Indigenous governing body. Are you aware of that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, in relation to the nation-to-nation and First Nations fisheries management plans.
Okay. I mention this because on November 20th, you testified that it is the Public Prosecution Service of Canada that determines whether charges are pursued. The Director of Public Prosecution Service of Canada was here recently and stated that she was not aware or not familiar with what the Fisheries Act deemed to be law. Mr. Lambertucci, is your office in possession of every fisheries-related agreement that the Ministry of Fisheries have finalized with Indigenous governing bodies, including those that would be bylaws?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and I would have to take that question away, Mr. Arnold, to see what we are in possession of to make sure that we are in possession of those laws and agreements.
So you don't know if you have actual possession of laws that could be out there?
We would be very aware of the regulations and the laws that are created because we are enforcing those conditions of license. In terms of where those agreements are housed, I would have to check in DFO.
But you may not know then of bylaws that could be out there that your officers would be expected to understand, to either enforce or recognize that there is an authorized activity under a different bylaw than the Fisheries Act?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Arnold, I wouldn't couch it in that manner. We are very aware of the laws and bylaws that exist around the conditions of license and regulations that we enforce.
Are you able to provide this committee with the bylaws that you are enforcing that are in these agreements?
I do not have the bylaws with me, and thank you for the question, but we would resource those bylaws and provide them.
You will provide those bylaws? You will resource and provide them to the committee?
Just one point of clarification. For clarity of the question, there are nation-to-nation agreements that take place between resource management and our First Nation communities. I don't want to speak for resource management.
And as lawmakers, I believe we have a responsibility to understand what laws are being made in Canada that affect the resources that we are expected to serve and protect along with you and your officers. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arnold. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes.
So I'm going to share my time with my colleague, Mr. Connors, but Mr. Lushington, I just want to give you a minute to clarify, even if we've talked about the email that you received. Was this email that you received by Parliamentary Affairs, was it an email that you received from the Minister Office staff, Minister Thompson, yes or no?
It was not from Minister Thompson.
Perfect, thank you very much. I share my time with Mr. Connor now.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Dinham for a few questions. Mr. Dinham, you're retired from Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, right? And you were involved with charges moving forward with the constabulary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's correct, Mr. Connors. I was with the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary for almost 26 years, or in policing for 26 years.
So we're doing a review of the Act to make recommendations to improve the Act and amendments as required. A number of witnesses have stated that laws under the Act are good, but there's challenges with the enforcement and actually getting to where charge approvals. From your experience, 26 years with the constabulary and how charges were laid there and approvals working with the Department of Justice and that, is there much difference between how it's done at the DFO and at RNC, and is there any change that we could make to improve it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are certainly, Mr. Connors, there certainly are some differences as it relates to the charge approval process within DFO and the policing side of becoming aware of that there's reasonable grounds to lay a charge and moving things forward. I'm aware that there are processes within DFO, certainly in particular here in Newfoundland and Labrador region, when we have matters that are ongoing, investigations that are going, where we have a review of a file before it moves to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada for prosecutions. That would be different from what would occur in most police agencies, and certainly I've worked for several, where the decision was made by the actual agency, whether or not there were reasonable grounds to believe that an offence has occurred, and then the charge is laid, and then the appropriate prosecuting agency, whether it be provincial or federal, that would take up the prosecution piece. So that's where there are differences. Personally, I would think that we would be better served, and this is just my own opinion based on experience. I think DFO will be better served if we had a similar process that police agencies use, where we determine the viability of a case and the evidence based on the evidence and the information, and then we move forward with our investigation package to a Crown prosecutors for the prosecution piece.
I'll just we've talked about peace officers and getting a number of people have mentioned that here today. As well, there's been witnesses who said that previously who said that it need to be insulated or arm's length. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Connors. In relation to being insulated and at arm's length from what, Mr. Connors? Just so I'm aware and
I guess from the department. I'd use the department as an example.
Okay, thank you for your question. I haven't seen, and this is personally again myself. I mean, I've been with Fisheries and Oceans now for 4.5 years. I haven't seen incidents where there's been an overbearing piece that affected, my ability to be a peace officer and to do my work. Some decisions, in relation to activities, yes, I may have differences of opinions with, but the arm's length piece, I'd have to think more on that and give you more time, or certainly myself more time to think about that. So I don't really have much of a good answer to give you on that.
Okay, if you can provide something in writing, be greatly appreciated.
Okay.
Mr. Lambergucci, it was stated here earlier in previous testimony today that the First Nations would have to give consent in order for charges to be laid. Is that a reality?
That is not a reality. And Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. That goes back to unauthorized is unauthorized. And when our case packaging goes forward, we do not seek consent. That goes to PPSC, who makes that assessment.
So the chief or no one with a band or anything like that has authority to say charges cannot be laid or should not be laid?
That would not be in the course of our practice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connors. And prochainement, on va à Monsieur Deschênes.
So now, Mr. Deschênes, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, Mr. Thorburn, in your practice when there's an investigation related to First Nations? And have you been told that you need to get the okay from the band before you can go ahead with your investigation?
Thank you for your question. The answer is yes. For the most part, for each Indigenous area that
I'm afraid I'm going to have to briefly stop here. We see the bells are going off right now. Given that they are ringing.
A little bit of time. I think
it's
very important what this gentleman's saying.
I know what I'm saying here is pursuant to Standing Order 115.5, is there unanimous consent to continue to sit for an additional 15 minutes? Yes.
To get there because my phone app is not working, so I must be.
Okay, yes, well 15 minutes would give you another 15 minutes to get there. And it looks like we have unanimous consent. Et Monsieur Deschênes, vous avez encore 2 minutes.
So, Mr. Deschênes, you still have 2 minutes of your time then. So I'll put the question to you again so you can answer again. So before you can go ahead with pursuing offences or prosecuting when it's something related to First Nations, you're saying you need to get authorization first from the band?
Support from the band. Thank you for the question, but ultimately it comes down to support from that First Nation whose member we were charging. That's a common theme. We've been in many situations where we have found illegal harvesting taking place and not being able to get the appropriate approvals from a local First Nation. And when it goes to charge approval, because anything as far as an Indigenous person, when we're charging them, it has to go through the charge approval process. That requirement, they usually come back to us and say, do you have the support of the person whose member this is? And that's usually where we get pushed back.
Cette façon de faire là depuis combien de temps?
And so for how long has this been the practice, the way of doing things?
Thank you for your question. This has been taking place for, I would say, the last 6-7 years. And I can't say this is taking place across Canada. It's just that our Public Prosecution Service has coming back to us saying that we need to consult with the First Nation and they need to approve the charges against their individual.
Merci. Monsieur Lushington, du coup.
Thank you. Mr. Lushington, on the maritime side, before you lay charges with a member of a First Nation, do you have to have the support of the band that's involved?
Thank you for the question. No, we don't. There's a difference. We investigate the matter completely. The officers goes, the file process is that we investigate the matter completely, draw it to a conclusion, and then we do an in-house review of the file, and then we put that file forward to PPSC for their review. And they ultimately made the decision whether the file proceeds or does not. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Deschênes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deschênes. I know if there would be more to say on this, and if you have more to say, you can send that in to the committee in writing.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have a contradiction here that I think requires some further questioning and investigation. Mr. Lambertucci, I asked you at a previous hearing whether that fisheries officers would be discouraged, first of all, whether the Department of Justice was weighing whether an Indigenous band supporting a charge when deciding whether to proceed with the prosecution. Is my understanding that you said that was not the case. I also asked you if fisheries officers were less likely to investigate or pursue certain crimes if they knew that it was less likely for that charge to be laid because there was no support from the band. You said that was not the case. I mentioned to you that I had heard from fisheries officers in my riding and across British Columbia where that was happening. You said you hadn't heard that. I feel like you could at least now acknowledge that you have heard the opposite. So can you shed some clarity, kind of first and foremost? One, is the Department of Justice weighing whether a band elected chief and council support charges being laid when deciding on whether to file those charges, yes or no?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It's not a yes or no answer, Mr.
I think it is a yes or no, whether they're weighing it or not.
I'll respectfully disagree with that. PPSC is independent in how they approach this situation.
So are they weighing it, yes or no, to your knowledge? Are you oblivious to what's happening?
I am not oblivious to what's happening.
So are they weighing it? Because we were told by another witness that there is a form that is filled out where they are asked whether the local band, the chief and council, supports charges being laid against that individual. Is that true? Does that form exist?
That is very clear that is taking place.
So why would they require the form if they're not weighing it as a factor of whether to pursue prosecution? Why do you have your own fishery officers literally saying right in front of you that then charges are sent back and they're not proceeding because of that fact?
Yeah, I'm not questioning what Mr. Thornburg is saying, Mr. Gunn. I will take this back and we will have that looked at.
Okay, I appreciate. We're all learning things here today. For the record, it wasn't just Mr. Thornburg. This has been coming up repeatedly, including at the session that was just happened before you. Another question while we're at it: Indigenous protected and conservation areas, when they're declared unilaterally by Indigenous groups, does DFO consider that area closed to fishing or open?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I have just recently started to learn about this issue, and that is an issue that is sometimes closed to commercial fishing, but it is enforced as an open fishing area as well. I would have to take that away and seek some clarification on it.
I appreciate that. If you could provide the clarification in writing, I'd appreciate that. I would like to say that I appreciate you spending so much time here and answering difficult questions. And as I appreciate as well, it seems to me that a lot of these issues are originating in the Department of Justice, and DFO officials are left to try to explain away what's actually going on. Mr. Thornburg, a question for you. You gave examples of having issues with charge approval when it came to FSC fisheries because there was no support from the elected chief and council and the band. Do you have a specific example of where this is happening, where you can think of a specific violation that was occurring and then charges were not brought because of a lack of support from the band? And of course, you can speak in general terms.
Yeah, thank you for the question. As far as charging those who are First Nations, I don't have any good examples to provide you as far as successes are concerned, because usually if we don't have...
Do you have failures, though, of where the charge approval wasn't given? I mean that you brought it up in your testimony that it was happening, so I'm assuming that the members of the committee would like to hear the example of when that would happen.
Yeah. We had a case when a First Nations fisherman from outside of his territory was fishing in another's territory, for example. If that person was fishing, because he was fishing outside of his territory, we were able to get confirmation from the band whose area he was fishing within to pursue charges against this individual. And in this particular case, we know this because when it comes to local First Nations, it's difficult to get that confirmation from those First Nations to allow them to support us when it comes to charges against their members.
I guess I was asking.
And I don't have any examples because we've been trying this for literally the last probably 8 to 10 years, and we've seen a significant change in our ability to charge individuals who are now First Nations. So I don't have any examples, but if you give me some time, I could find some for you to provide.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunn. And we're going to complete by Mr. Clausen for 5 minutes, sir.
Very much. I'm going to share my time with Mr. Morrissey. I just want to thank all of you for the work that you've shed a lot of light on as to the dangers and the responsibilities that you carry here. And we've heard from both the minister and from Mr. Lambertucci the statement that illegal fishing will not be tolerated has several answers. And so to your comment, Mr. Lushington, about in the last 5 months that things have changed, and I appreciate hearing that. I just want to know whether that is something that you would say the entire industry is aware of, that things are changing, and or if you could expand on that just a little bit.
Thank you for the question. I think industries learns most often from what they receive in media. Okay? And so as we move forward with our operations, it's important that we provide media lines that are timely, that so commercial fisheries and also First Nations can understand what the objectives is that we're trying to do or what has been done, i.e. if somebody has reported illegal fishing, we conducted an operation, we apprehended the individual. We can't say names, we're limited to what we can say. But when we can start putting that in the media, it kind of eases the conscience of the public. That way they don't take it out in their own hands. We are doing better. I can only say, just look at what we've done in the last 3-4 months. The files that we've put up since March, serious files. Officers have been assaulted with weapons. We put them up. We put up a lot of files in a short window, and these files aren't small anymore. They're thick because the burden is shifting to the officers in more detail. As we have a file with a possible infringement on a constitutional right, the file's thicker. The burdens are elevated.
Thank you.
Time?
2 minutes and 45 seconds.
I would ask if you could provide to the committee some direction on what would be required to strengthen the term peace officer. I'm impressed with that testimony that was given and the fact that how you are being limited or restricted by the fact that you are not adequately termed, I will use, that limits your ability to fully enforce the law. So if you could, and I would ask the chief to provide some direction not direction, but the clarification to the committee on the peace officer restriction that is limiting the ability of very important DFO protection people to fully enforce the law. Is that something that could be provided, Chief? Like that. Chief Lambert-Tusi.
Thank you for the chair.
Because there was a reference made to a peace officer. It's not really clear, and so it leaves what I'm interpreting is leaving confusion in the mind of the officer in the field and could actually put them in harm's way. That's something very important that the committee could act on.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. If I have time to reply verbally, I can also reply in writing. But yes, fishery officers are limited as peace officers restricted to the Fisheries Act. Anything to do with public safety or other criminal code offenses that fall beyond the Act, Fisheries Act, they do not have peace officer powers. In addition, they do have the ability for obstruction or assault to take those actions with those peace officer powers if they occur, but there is still a referral for investigation to a peace officer, law enforcement of jurisdiction.
Okay, in the bit of time that I may have, there's been reference to better traceability would be a game changer on fish laundering. And could you provide, either in testimony or written advice, how this committee could recommend improvements that would make better traceability and begin to act on fish laundering? Because fish is being used to launder money, fish laundering.
And sorry, Mr. Lambert-Tusi, if you could answer briefly and more by writing would be helpful.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Briefly speaking, yes, traceability would enhance our ability and fisheries officers' abilities for enforcement. I will provide extra information in writing. Traceability is in place in the ELVR enforcement continuum, and those conditions of license and traceability have been helpful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrissey, and that concludes our second panel. I do want to thank our witnesses for being here and their testimony and for their service. And your testimony is certainly going to be very helpful as we finalize the report and the recommendations that are going to flow from it. And of course, if there's anything that came up today or otherwise that you would like to share with the committee to help in that work, please make sure you do so in writing. But with that, we'll conclude this meeting. Next meeting is not going to be until the end of January, where we're going to review the first draft of the Redfish report. And just a reminder to send all of your recommendations and additional thoughts and instructions for the review of the Fisheries Act no later than Friday. And if all goes well, we can have that completed by the end of February. But with that, I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Meeting adjourned.